So this is a really cool session because the previous 3 talks tie in very neatly with my talk. So I'm a little bit different than maybe some of you here. I'm a practitioner and a scientist. And I'm going to be talking today about some actual baboon management models in the urban space. Going to compare and contrast 2 specific ones. So to give a little background, although there were a lot of hands raised when you were asked, have you lived with baboons or seen baboons around your areas, but some background on the causes of conflict, what the ultimate conflict where it starts. And that is baboons naturally seek low-lying land throughout their sub-Saharan range, so they are very predisposed to moving into these lower areas, more productive vegetation, better access to water. But these are also the areas that are typically developed by people first. They're easier to farm in, they're easier to build on, and so this immediately creates an overlap before we even begin to look at the conflict. And this is just an example here, an image of, on the left-hand side, all the low-lying land in the Cape Peninsula as an example. The red overlaying there as the areas that are low-lying that are urbanized, and then the difference on the right-hand side that you can see of what's actually left for the baboons. And that section in the bottom is Cape Point Reserve, so that doesn't have any urbanization, but that's more or less the only kind of stronghold of low-lying uninterrupted space. But urban areas are also a magnet for baboons. They're greatly attracted to these areas for access to food from houses, from waste, from vegetable gardens, etc. Again, access to water, and there's also a number of other benefits in these spaces that need to be researched more, but for instance, thermoregulatory benefits. They use our infrastructure for shelter from the sun, from the rain, so there's lots of reasons for them to try and want to come to these spaces. But there are, of course, lots of consequences for people when they're living in these areas, and we know that baboons spending time in the urban area leads to negative impacts on human safety and well-being, damage to properties and financial losses, decrease in property values, and exposure to zoonotic diseases from baboons. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is what it can look like when a baboon gets into your house after just a matter of minutes. And we can also have direct conflicts as well, where there is physical competition for food, and then of course the property damage as well. And unfortunately what this can look like is once baboons have learned to use these spaces, they will continue to ramp up their efforts to get these foods. And they're very, very intelligent, very agile. And these kinds of behaviors at this stage are very, very difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. Okay? But this has consequences for baboons as well, of course. Baboons spending time in the urban area has led to compromised health, welfare, and poor conservation value. We know a lot about their health risks in these spaces: dental decay, pre-diabetes, exposure to toxins, and exposure to human diseases as well. Those are zoonotic diseases that go back and forth between people and baboons. And these images are a little bit gory, so if you're sensitive, look away. We also know that direct urban-induced mortality and injury is very, very high in an urban space. And this might be directly through shooting or poisoning, but we know that our urban areas also pose risks to baboons through less controllable factors such as dog attacks, motor vehicle accidents, and electrocutions. Importantly, we know that urban-related deaths in wildlife are associated with immense and often prolonged suffering. And this is not something that we want for our wildlife. Baboons, whether you love them or hate them, they do have an important ecological role, and we do need them especially in our famous ecosystems. So we're going to look first at the urban exclusion model, which our best representation of that is the Urban Baboon Program. I didn't mention earlier, but I am the project manager and conservation scientist for this program for the last 4 years. And this is run by the City of Cape Town, currently managed by our company NCC Environmental Services. So due to urban sprawl, extensive urban sprawl, the Cape Peninsula baboon population is trapped in overlap with people. And this is the extent of the urban troops ranges, but there are more further troops in the south there. So the City of Cape Town initiated this program, which was designed to reduce direct overlap between people and baboons in the interests of both parties. And over the course of this program, which has run for more or less 20 years in some form, we've learned a lot. So what we realized did not work in the beginning was that the baboon management team in charge of dealing with this situation were quite reactive and dysfunctional. The program was erratic and poorly funded, And the program was managed by an animal rights activist, or entity rather, activism. Not that there's an issue with this, but there can be some malalignment, let's say, between conservation and animal rights. There is also a lot of overlap, but sometimes it can cause discord. Baboon troops were spending about 30% of their time in the urban areas, which is a lot of time. And we saw, as a result, high levels of baboon habituation to this landscape. And as a result, we saw that over half of all deaths were the result of humans or the urban landscape itself. And when we looked later on, from 2009 onwards, management, research, and policy aligned. Funding increased to about 14 million rand per year, which is currently what it costs. It is expensive. And the program was taken over to be managed by behavioral ecologists, so much more aligned with the conservation angle and the ecological angle directly. And as a result, we saw less than 10% of the time baboons were spending in the urban areas, and then of course, a decrease in the number of deaths related to baboons, related to humans, down to about 14% of all deaths, so a giant drop there. And why did it work? Aversive conditioning was introduced to assist the field rangers in keeping baboons out of urban areas. So the program currently employs about 90 rangers who are on the ground 365 days a year, from sunrise until sunset. And additionally, guidelines on how to manage and respond to situations that might arise were fine-tuned. These include health and condition, response to severe injury and disease, damage-causing situations, and dispersing or displaced male baboons. So the success of this urban inclusion model led to an increased baboon population. The population is over 600 baboons at the moment, which was around, I want to say 200 baboons at the start of the program 20 odd years ago, or in the late 90s. Improved baboon welfare and health, improved conservation value, improved genetics between the two subpopulations in the peninsula, and of course improved resident well-being and livelihoods, because there's less overlap, so there's less potential for conflict. So for my PhD, I heard about this magical place called Royals, which of those of you who have not heard of it, it's about an hour to the east of the Cape Peninsula, tiny, tiny little village across the way. And Royals gave me an opportunity to study an inclusion model, so to compare and contrast these two models. So this village is within the Kokelberg Biosphere Reserve, and it's been a registered urban conservancy since 2004. And it's very small, as I mentioned, about 250 built houses, half of which are permanently occupied, the rest are holiday or weekend getaways. And in this area, the troop that lives in this area is not locked into conflict or overlap with people. They live in an open population, so they can move away from this area much more easily than in the Cape Peninsula. Now, the village itself, the properties in this area are minimally developed, and they are predominantly natural fambos gardens. So people don't have unprotected veggie patches or fruit trees or a lot of exotic plants, full stop. And importantly, residents have elected to share space with baboons here. So they've chosen to live this way and rather focus on managing themselves as opposed to managing the baboons. So the baboons can come and go through the village as they please. So I needed to understand what's going on here, because on the other side, we see people who just can't live with this conflict, who are having a lot of issues. It's a completely different angle. And so I wanted to understand more about this acceptance in the residents of sharing this space. And what I found was that there were three things that were really, really important and came out significant in this modeling of acceptance, which was wildlife value orientations, which some of you may be familiar, if not all of you, which have been applied a lot to other wildlife species, but not really specifically to baboons, but looking at this spectrum of how you value that animal, specifically used in conflict scenarios as well, and management. The other two are emotion and attitude. And we know, they predicted acceptance. And we know emotions and attitudes towards baboons are very important. So actually, I did my master's on baboons in Knysna. And from my master's, I found that many people believe baboons are dangerous, which has already been discussed in this session. This leads to a more negative attitude towards baboons, a decrease in concern for their conservation, and an increased desire to take lethal action. So these are really, really important factors. When I looked at this community, I found that most people were not afraid of baboons. Most people had a mutualistic or a pluralistic perspective or value orientation on baboons, meaning that they feel that the animals have more of a right, they lean on that side, to be in the space that they want to be in. Most people liked baboons, quite a lot, in fact. And generally speaking, people considered it not stressful to share space with them in this area. It's really fascinating. And what we also found was that acceptance in your mind, the psychological acceptance, directly predicted physical acceptance of where you wanted the baboons to be. So when asked where people would choose for baboons to be in the grand scheme, in an ideal world, where would they choose? And the majority said, fine for them to come to the village. I want them to be in the village. In fact, almost 80% said they want them on their properties. So this is crazy. Like, this is not what you'd expect, I'm sure. Why are they so positive towards baboons? 72% said that they felt positive because of education and awareness that had happened in their communities. And actually, over a period of over 20 years, the community internally did quite a lot of awareness and education campaigns and provided residents with information on how to live alongside them, how to protect their homes, and what to do if they got into their houses. And we also saw an incredible level of baboon-proofing of their properties and their houses specifically. So almost everyone had baboon-proof window fixtures on their windows so they can leave the windows open. Over half had baboon-proof door fixtures. 84% had strict house rules to prevent entry into their houses. And 99% had baboon-proof bins. Excuse me. I will add that the 1% that didn't had electric fences around their properties, so the baboons couldn't get that waste either. So now I need to know about the baboons, because what are these, like fantasy baboons? There's no conflict, everything is great. And what we found was that the home range, this is the extent of their home range, or estimated home range, which is about 6 kilometers squared, it's a pretty small area, was that they strongly selected for the urban landscape, despite the fact that they can go anywhere, despite the fact that they're not getting human foods, which we'll learn about now. This is the outline of the village itself, and you can see the darker the blue, the more frequent they're using it. So they're there almost all the time. So they're selecting for the urban area, selecting for lower altitudes again, and selecting for areas closer to their sleep sites. But then I also wanted to understand how they use different properties differently. And what I found was that they selected for areas with larger lawns. Grasses are really important or prized fallback food in winter, so areas with larger lawns, areas closer to the singular household in the village, which I'm sure you can guess where it was, that was feeding baboons. This was birdseed and or crushed mealies pretty much every day. One household strongly predicted their movement. And then properties who do not deter the baboons. So where baboons were kind of welcome and they weren't chased away, then they would logically spend a little bit more time there. And the diet is really, really important. So what are they eating in this area? Are they, again, eating completely different? And they were. So they were eating predominantly fambos, which is what we want them to eat, followed by grass. Again, that's particularly in the wintertime. Provision food from this one household, small amount of exotic vegetation, and then really, really importantly, less than 4% of their diet was human-derived food sources from rubbish, houses, or vehicles. And I will point out that this percentage was basically made up in a period of 5 weeks during holiday season when there are visitors and tourists and people who are not as baboon-wise. So this is fascinating because baboons are spending their time in an urban area pretty much every single day, but they're not eating people food. They're actually still servicing the environment. So does this model work? It works to a large degree. People are mostly happy to share space. They mostly take responsibility for preventing conflict. Baboons are eating predominantly natural food, so they're still servicing the ecosystem. And direct conflicts with residents are low. But baboon mortality remains very high in this community. 20 deaths were recorded over a period of 4 years, and 70% of these were urban causes. This was namely within the infant age class, and they were a result of motor vehicle collisions. For those of you who are familiar with Royals, know that the R44 highway splits through the village itself. So baboons have to cross over that road in order to get into the village, and so they have this risk of this road situation. Well, we also had dogs. Each age class lost one individual as a result of dog attacks, and one resident who bludgeoned a baboon to death, because that's what happens. So this is not great. This was not what I expected to find. I thought, cool, if we can be responsible, then it can work. Not the case. And in fact, infant mortality in this troop was up to almost 40% higher than you would find in completely wild troops. This is not good for the baboons. So there's a lot of lessons, and I could literally do an entire conference about this situation, but I tried to boil it down, and I'm probably already over time. Urban areas present a complex matrix of risks, and we learned this from both models, even when residents behave responsibly. Baboon proofing is, of course, vitally important and responsible, and it does reduce direct conflicts, but it doesn't keep baboons out of urban areas. These houses were completely baboon-proofed. Baboons were there every day. Education and awareness are key to increasing resident tolerance and responsible behavior. Regardless of your model, you need to have this. And I bring this up to this conference because we know that there is a huge rise of baboon and human interaction in urban spaces throughout the Western Cape. And this is going to continue as we're transforming the land. Baboons are incredibly adaptive. They are not going to go away. They're going to learn more and more and more and more and more. So addressing the issues, I will say the first is that municipalities, whether they like it or not, and they typically don't, have to own this issue. They need to be looking from a mandate of their residents and visitors' safety, security, and health. It needs to be led by the municipalities. The second is that it has to be supported by the local conservation authority, authorities, looking after the environmental and conservation aspect of this from their mandate. And then importantly, the programs have to be led by experts. It has to be informed by science in biology, human dimensions, and conflict. These overlap, but they also don't, and you need to understand all of it. It's an incredibly, incredibly complex situation. The programs need to be interdisciplinary. So some of what you've seen is you had one program who was focusing exclusively, the exclusion model, on the baboons, almost entirely. And then you had the other one that's just focusing pretty much almost entirely on the people. We need to bring them together. They are a conflict together. So maintaining the baboons in the natural space from the baboon angle is an important part of this model, of this program, focusing on the conservation, welfare, and health as a group of those baboons, and then moving towards proactive rather than reactive management and response. This is something that human nature just doesn't allow us to do, but we actually need to be thinking about the problems before the problems come, especially conflict scenarios where you're dealing with this incredibly adaptable, intelligent animal. It's so hard to reverse, and it becomes very, very costly. And then we also need to include the people. There needs to be an increased emphasis on education. We do quite a lot of that as our company, but it's actually not a big part of the project as it's designed. We need to increase understanding of baboons, why people have baboon visits, what attracts them, what they can do to keep the baboons away, and understanding the conflict in general. People often don't know, even living in Cape Town, why baboons are there. We need to help reduce fears and increase tolerance. Even if you go for an exclusion model, you will never 100% exclude baboons. And so you still have to prepare people to understand that fear if they do experience it. And very importantly, guide people on how to have practical solutions for their properties. It's really important that people in this conflict or this fearful state have an increased locus of control, because they can control their area while government and other authorities and whatever are controlling the bigger picture. Expert communication and engagement, I couldn't stress this more. The people who are running the program, who are dealing with this kind of situation, need to be knowledgeable on it. You can't engage meaningfully or kind of help in any situation if you don't know enough about the topic. They cannot be conflict averse. It's an incredibly tense field to be in. You can't run away from conflict. It doesn't matter how hard you cover your ears and cover your eyes. You can't step away from that. So you can't run away. It's not going to get better. The next is transparency and easy access to communication. This is very, very vital as well. And then finally, being empathetic. People in these situations don't know what to do. You're dealing with a giant wild animal. There's fear, there's losses, there's differences in values. Communication has to be empathetic in this space. That is all. Thank you.